what I had wanted to focus on was especially the wars that, well, not even necessarily the wars, more of the rebellions, because a rebellion's more than a war, or not a rebellion, revolution. It's really just a changing of ideas and a changing of ways people perceive them, you know? And so I wanted to look up, especially in early American history, was the difference between these wars and, well, not necessarily the difference, but more of why it went wrong, why they failed, why we don't hear too much about it. And the story I wanted to start it off with is the picture right here. It's Tenochtitlan. I don't know how to pronounce it. I'm sorry, but it was basically the Mexica Aztec. It was the capital. It was basically a city built on the water, and the Aztec beforehand had ruled with the iron fist. Really, they killed a lot of the smaller surrounding tribes. Constantly at their life hell. They were just constantly, demanding this, sacrificing it. The Aztec were a power hungry group, and eventually the natives would have enough of it, but none of that would really come to play until eventually the Spanish landed in Latin America. And eventually, when they came looking for gold, specifically Hernan Cortez, who became the general of the Spanish side of this, he knew what he had wanted. Everyone knew he was looking for gold, and whenever they figured out exactly how powerful they were and what they wanted, they understood that they'd point them in the direction of the people who had already, well, not colonized, but taken precedence over their life. And so they pointed the new strong kid on the block to the former strong kid on the block. And that leads to the first problem of why a lot of these wars failed, especially this war, was just, well, first of all, the power of the Spanish. Because when they showed up, they had far superior weaponry, and then they could just do whatever they want. But especially with this war, that's not seen too much outside of it because of its timing, is the helping the natives in the surrounding area. Yes, they were so cruel to them that they helped the Spanish, not knowing exactly what that would bring. But yeah, so this war was, I would say, probably one of the first revolutions. But it was happened kind of strangely, because whenever he got there, he was welcomed in. The emperor at the time, Montezuma II, I'll call him Montezuma from now on, or just the emperor. But he invited him in, not knowing like, oh, the Spanish are gonna take over to do what they want. He thought it was just he was being cordial, and eventually they figured out what was going on, and a lot of hostility broke out. And the war, it wasn't even against Montezuma, really. He was trapped within the city with the Spanish. And eventually they had killed him, but they didn't want anyone to know they killed him because, well, at the time they were at war, they thought the other natives would blame them and not trust them if they had known they'd killed him. So they had said he was killed by his own people, kind of promoting their own image. That was later proven to be, well, it's argued about to this day, but it's very likely that it was the Spanish. And so with the Spanish doing basically whatever they wanted, they walked into the city, and probably the most damaging part, especially in these early conflicts, is disease. Because when they came over from couple month long boat rides, they came with a lot of smallpox, whatever disease that had never been actually shown or not necessarily revealed to, but put into the way of a Native American person. Or not Native American, indigenous people. I'm sorry, they're not necessarily all Native Americans, but when they came over, a lot of people instantly got sick and they didn't know how to deal with it. And the people killing them are the only ones who know how to deal with it, but even then, their bodies were not used to or could sustain something like smallpox because it instantly killed them. And it helped win the war, it really did. And it wiped out so many soldiers and even then just weakened a lot of the forces that they had, and they never had a chance. As soon as they came into contact with all these diseases, it was just, the war lasted relatively like 3 years, but the result was known pretty early on. And the second war I wanted to bring out is not necessarily a war I want to focus on so much more than a person, and this is Tupac Amaru. And in a lot of people's eyes, he was regarded as the last Incan emperor. So, with him being the last Incan emperor, well, when I say thought to be, is because a lot of what was of the Incan Empire was killed and just wiped out. And he was a revolutionary. He held firmly that he would hold their beliefs and everything they believed in, and he would keep it going. He would keep it moving forward, and he fought the Spanish a lot. He was one of the, I would say, probably the first revolutionary of early Latin America against the Spanish rule. His name is known very well, and he's very inspirational to a lot of people around the world who are fighting. And what I want to focus on is, well, his image almost precedes him, because he was not that successful. A lot of the things he had was just guerrilla tactics. He did a lot of damage, sure, but a lot of his things are just focused on speed and just being quiet. And eventually, it caught up to him. And later on in the 1500s, whenever power eventually caught up with him, he was trapped inside of a fort with Spanish forces surrounding him, and eventually he could do nothing. And they, I'm sorry. So they surrounded him, and then they eventually executed him. A lot of people think he was kind of almost, at that point, a martyr. Not as well, a martyr in a fight for liberty, really, more than just a specific war. But even then, I will talk more about his lasting impact a little bit later. Not necessarily him, but the Incan Revolution a little bit later. But knowing him as a person, and he eventually just... The Spanish were just too powerful. The last war had a lot of disease and the native help. What really happened with him was also, actually, I forgot to mention, the native help, because they were they were convinced to be so scared of the Spanish that they would instantly do whatever they can. Not that the natives necessarily gave him up or betrayed him, but a lot of what his ideals and ideas were portrayed, which I will talk about more later. The next war I want to talk about, it was a war, I specifically picked this war too. It happened more it happened more recently. It was 1824. It was the Chumash Revolution. And it's kind of disconnected from the other ones I've talked about, especially, because this happened in almost colonial America rather than more Latin. But I think it was very important because, well, just the timing of it was 1824. The American Revolution had been fought just about 50 years before. And the Chumash people have been, they knew the other colonizers there. Everyone was understood of what was going on, and they had taken power. And eventually, when the Mexican Revolution broke out around 1821, some of their supply lines got cut off, and some of the soldiers there got a bit antsy. I don't want to be disrespectful, and eventually this led to the killing of a young Chumash boy, and this led to the revolution. And this revolution kind of just signifies an end, because this is not necessarily the last one we saw, but this is one of the last ones that we saw that did not change at least something. Because whenever it eventually came up, when they eventually fought, it didn't last very long. It only lasted just a couple months, really. And the result of it just shows it was a complete loss. They had killed 300 Mexican soldiers and only 2,000... Or they only killed 300 soldiers, and 2,000 of their own kind got murdered just trying to fight for their own individual freedom. And in the time of, well, it's not necessarily a given name for this time period, but I like to really think of it as a time of liberty, because there were so many revolutions going on around the world after the American Revolution that inspired so much. Even the French Revolution had a lot of inspirations in Latin America because of really, well, first of all, just the idea of the revolution, and then eventually Spain and some of the other countries in Europe that had direct power over some of these countries were dealing with Napoleon, and or even just the French Revolution before Napoleon. And they just kept fighting and fighting, but eventually, I think this just signifies, this is just all wraps together what, really what they fought for and how they lost. They were fighting just for little freedom, they didn't want they're mad that their young boy got killed, but even then, when they fought, they were proven not to necessarily be wrong, but to be silenced, because they instantly died. And it was almost sad, because they had planned this revolution, or this rebellion, for months, and it's almost accomplished nothing, which is sad to say. The difference about this one, too, it was just the power of the colonial people it was Mexican people at this time. It was just their power, not necessarily disease, not the help of the natives, which shows, even the last couple wars, how it was decided. The power of the Spanish alone, it contributed so much to Spanish victory. It was insane. And the help that they also had from other themes in past wars helped, but it really always boils down to the power that the Spanish had. So, the last one that I want to talk about, this is a picture of some Incan dances going on. This is obviously a picture, not a painting, because it still goes on in recent times. And the thing I really want to talk about is something relating to Tupac Amaru, which I had spoken about earlier. It was the Tati-Oncoy Rebellion. And there's not really a face behind it. You could say Tupac Amaru, a lot of people, because when he died, it was the end of it, effectively. But it was not necessarily a war being fought just purely, like, gun to gun, bow to bow, whatever type of war that comes to mind whenever you think about war. It was just a revolution that was trying to keep many of the Incan ideals and religious beliefs alive. And the sad thing, I'll go over the sad things first, is that the way they dealt with it, the Spanish, they instilled so much fear into so many people that they would instantly give up whoever was doing these. And then whoever was doing these, they'd go to their houses, or wherever they might have been, and they would torture and execute them, and they would be made an example. And just, again, like I mentioned before, the power of the Spanish is the main reason why so many of these revolutions failed, that even the fear of what their power could bring led to the end of this rebellion, because it was just so much fear and everyone not trusting each other. It was an evil deed in the world, but just the mention of the Spanish power alone ended this, which is insane to say. But on a higher note, as I showed you in this picture, there's the Incan culture is still alive today. The Tati-Oncoy Rebellion, technically, a lot of historians like to end it when Tupac Amaru died, because that was the last of the Incan emperors, and there was never really too much problems after that. But just the idea, the Tati-Oncoy Rebellion, I like to think it represents more of an idea than a time period, because it kept so much of their culture alive that it didn't let it go extinct. Of course, a lot of the cultures that were in early Latin America were just burnt down. Like, it was just disintegrated from the face of the earth. That it's almost amazing that some of these things still survived. Whether or not people were allowed to express it back in the day, we still understand and know about it now because of the ideas people had to keep pushing their past forward, keep their beliefs alive. And it's almost awful to think how much was taken away from them. But I think it's almost beautiful to really think how much they kept fighting for what little they could put forward. And just the idea knowing that some of these things are still alive today, even against the Spanish power, which I've talked about so much, that took down everything, it still exists because they want it to exist. And because they willed it to exist. And just to wrap up the scene, not even talking about Latin American history, it just shows what a people can do and how much willpower can really get you, even in the face of just the immortal, or the Spanish were really. And they still, in some little ways, succeeded in presenting and fixing and keeping up their culture. And I think that's just beautiful.